Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by Michael Sousson. He is a critically acclaimed and produced author, and he has a background in international affairs. He used to work at the UN. He was in that whole oil for food thing. If you don't remember it, don't worry, we'll get back into it. That was kind of the first big scandal I was ever conscious of when I was in high school. So this is an exciting moment. If you
All
had
right.
talked to me in grad school, this would have been like the most amazing thing ever. Like I could text five friends right now and they would just die that I'm talking to this man. But he has a history of CNN. He was on K Street in Washington. That's the lobbying street. And he's now a storyteller, an independent journalist. And this is, I mean, the level of guests we've been getting around here is really tremendous. And Michael is the creme de la creme, the cherry on top of the cake in the window. Um, and we're going to talk about the film about his experience at the UN and the Oil for Food program. We're going to talk about, which stars Ben Kingsley, no less. And then we're going to talk about modern media and influence. And then we're going to get into his next book about influence. So, welcome, Michael, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Yes, the we've been trying to arrange this for several weeks, and Lily decided to do this morning, which was fun. But that's sometimes what happens with high profile guests. So we love it. So I want to start kind of right in and talk about your film, well, the film rather, Backstabbing for Beginners. Why don't you run us through the film, your story, a little bit about the absolute disaster that was the UN Oil for Food program, and kind of just get the reader to know you a little bit, and we'll start from there.
Right. So, well, I guess the event that projected me into the limelight to begin with was not when I was working at the UN, but sometime after I had left. Um, the UN Oil for Food program was the largest humanitarian program in UN history. It was set up to help the Iraqi people survive the sanctions which we at the UN had put on them. So there was a sort of a central core irony in the situation to begin with.
Well, the oil
But
was sanctioned. They couldn't sell it on the open market, so Europe traded oil it needed for food Iraq needed. That was kind of the barter arrangement.
yeah, it became known as the Oil for Food program, but it involved a lot more than food, obviously, because
Right.
a country doesn't run on food alone. So we visited, the first UN guy to come and visit Iraq after the first Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War, as we used to call it. Basically reported back that the country had been bombed back to the pre-industrial age, which means that their electrical grid was destroyed. Um, and that in the first Gulf War, America fought in a logic that resembles more the kind of fighting that we saw in World War II. So they completely destroyed Iraq's infrastructure and left Saddam Hussein in power. So at the end of the war, it finished in a very clean way, in a sense. At the time, everybody, there was a big parade on Fifth Avenue. But the fact is, we had left a country under the control of Saddam Hussein, who was fundamentally a person that the U.S. would never trust again, and then ended up framing as we now know in 2003 in what became the second war, in which regime change was then the goal. But unfortunately, I remember it very well because I had already left the UN at that point, and I was going to come back because um, I lived in the East Village in New York. At the time, I had gone to film school. I was going to completely change my career, in fact. And I received a call, and I was like having to respond to questions such as, what should be the UN's role in the post-war Iraq, and etc. And I quickly understood that nobody actually had a plan for the aftermath. Um, so whereas the U.S. Army was very good at uh, taking control of the country, they weren't very good at managing the country after. They never really thought of the fact that if you break it, you own it. So
Well, and
Iraq is.
there were a lot of mistakes made, letting the military go, all these trained fighters just out into the public. I mean, I think they burnt through the first, occupational governor in like 8 months because they didn't know what was going on. I think they burnt through three by the time it was all said and done. Yeah,
That's right.
there was clearly the Pentagon did not think about okay, well, what happens the day after we've completely invaded this place? Yeah. Lots of
Well,
time spent
they
on the
had a
invasion,
plan.
nothing on the rebuild.
Yeah, their plan was very short. It was to put Ahmed Chalabi in power,
Right.
and then hope for the best. The problem is that there was a war within the war, which was essentially a war for budgets in Washington, uh, and that means that the CIA and the State Department on the one side were fighting for certain budgets that were initially entirely allocated to the Pentagon. This was going to be the Pentagon's war. But once they were in there and they realized they had to actually rule a very unruly place, a very difficult place to rule, because of the sectarian divisions and of course the Shia Sunni division and the ethnic divisions with the Kurds, uh, and with two countries right next to them, meaning Syria and Iran, which both had an interest in making sure the Iraqi attempt at democracy would fail.
Well,
They
let's also not
encouraged
forget
a lot.
all those borders in that region were written by Britain and France after World War One and make no sense to the actual life people live on the ground whatsoever, which is why all the lines are straight and not mindful of where people actually live. Just putting that out there. Continue.
But it's very true. I mean, the line is straight between Iraq and Jordan because they drew it exactly at the midpoint between Amman and Baghdad.
Yeah. It
The
was
the
convenient for colonial
British.
planners, but not great for the people on the ground.
No, and this road, which used to be called the Triangle of Death, if you look at movies like War Dogs, for example, this Sunni area between Amman and Baghdad has always been, since the adventures of Gertrude Bell and Lawrence of Arabia, had always been sort of sort of a refuge for thieves and gangs and etc. Which eventually gave us ISIS and Daesh, or however people prefer to call it.
Right.
Yeah, no. So yeah, no, we were left with a situation that was very chaotic, and during which they found Saddam's secret list of who he had done illicit deals with,
Mm.
which means that essentially what was supposed to be a humanitarian program had in fact been hijacked by the regime, and that 2,200 or 2,300, I can't remember exactly the number of international corporations involved in providing the food, the electricity, the pharmaceutical. You can imagine it went from Viagra to powdered milk. Okay.
Right.
Uh, we
So we're
essentially
gonna
had
need to call Nestle, Carnation, Coca-Cola, Pepsi.
including American
Everybody. We're calling
companies like
everyone.
Mexico and Halliburton and
Yes.
but
If anyone
Volvo,
just wants to line up
Mercedes.
at the next Davos meeting, we'll just take down your names and call your people. That's
Everyone was involved. We basically at the UN were in charge of the economy of an entire country,
right.
which was a very, very awkward position to put the UN in to begin with. But what happened is when that list was published, first in an Iraqi newspaper, uh, um, I understood that we would need to see if that list was real or not. And KPMG had been brought in, and they had said that based on their forensic, uh, look at it, it was authentic. But on that list, many, many important people's names were on it, including French ambassadors, and foreign ministers of South Africa, India, very high level Australian also politicians. So we had to figure out whether and most disturbingly for me, my boss's boss at the UN, who is the guy I traveled to Iraq with a lot to try to assess the situation and the needs. So he was on the list, and so what I ended up doing is I called the office of Kofi Annan at the time, and I told them
Former
that there was no
Secretary
way
General of the
around.
United Nations, for those that don't know.
That's right. I think it's the last semi-competent Secretary General the UN has had, because the ones since have just been from bad to worse.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah,
had a
I
friend in
called them up
college
and I
who
told them there were 7 investigations gearing up in Congress.
mm,
And I know what happens because I had prior experience covering scandals with CNN and being on K Street and advising corporations that were called into hearings and so on. So I told him this is not going to go away. You can't push it under the bed. But they didn't listen. And so I found myself then having spent my most sort of idealistic years at the UN, trying to make the system work from the inside, and really doing my best. And after having done my best and seeing how corrupt it still was, I simply resigned. I hadn't planned on becoming a whistleblower or anything like that. But when I realized that they weren't going to investigate this themselves or allow a proper independent investigation, I decided that I needed to take my own position, make my own position clear, and that essentially became an op-ed, which was published in the Wall Street Journal, and which snowballed because suddenly everybody agreed that there should be an independent investigation, which was very ironic because basically most countries hadn't received any proper um, uh, instructions from their foreign office, because it wasn't the foreign offices or the state departments of countries that were in charge of monitoring our operation. It was actually the CIA and the MI6, etc.
Foreign
Because
intelligence agencies who are
yeah,
famously open and transparent and have tons of oversight.
that's
That's,
right. So
that's
since they have zero oversight, they also had no time to give instructions to their ambassadors, and so they found themselves all sitting around a table. And Kofi Annan's son had been also on the list, involved in some dirty deals, allegedly. Um, And so they ended up voting for what I had called for in an op-ed, and then suddenly I had to go testify in Congress, and suddenly, basically, I was slapped with the whistleblower label. I think a true whistleblower is someone that blows the whistle while he's in office or
Yeah.
in their duty. I had actually just resigned myself, and I just wanted to know the truth because the UN is good at one thing: it's good at keeping files.
Mm.
And so um, Kofi Annan appointed a very, very qualified man to lead the investigation. He asked for 30 very experienced FBI and Scotland Yard investigators. They basically raided our former office and took all the computers and took all the files. And I had to testify in front of that committee as well. And so then the Oil for Food program dominated the press for about a year in 2004 or 5, because it was a drip, drip, drip of information that kept looking worse and worse. And so in democratic countries, most of the companies that had basically broken the law, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, but every country has an equivalent. That was a lot of scalps for a DA to be able to bring to pay huge fines, which meant millions of dollars going into the coffers of Western governments rather than actually going back to the people of Iraq, which is the people we stole the money from to begin with.
Right.
But so then there was interest in hearing about that story, and it kind of gave me suddenly an act 3 to my experience at the UN, which had really started at the very candid age of 24, when I had a very rapid sort of introduction to the real world, first with a job at CNN, then with a job on K Street, which, as you said, in Washington is where the lobbying firms are. I just thought I was going to go to a law firm to train for law school, but I quickly understood the game that was going on in Washington. So it gave me a bit of a sort of it gave me a little prep for what a scandal like that could look like, and I didn't realize I would be at the center of it at all. But since I was the only UN person actually prepared to open my mouth and talk about what we had done right and what we had done wrong. Then a lot of press inquiries came, and what started as a short story about the first day I had to go to Iraq after just being hired at the age of 24, with a boss whose elocution I just could not understand. He was an Armenian Cypriot who had some kind of speech impediment that I couldn't put my finger on. And so it just started with me describing this scene of me in the limo with this guy that I didn't understand, heading to Iraq just 1 week after I was hired at the UN, in the middle of a conflict where the US was bombing and the UN weapons inspectors were going in and were going out, and we were flying in on this albatross of a UN airplane, piloted by a drunk Ukrainian pilot. I mean, I can't tell you how really intense that trip was.
So this must be the
But
beginning of backstabbing for beginners then.
so, well, yeah, it was the beginning of my experience at the UN, and the reason why I eventually called my book "Backstabbing for Beginners" was, of course, because my tone in writing the book was a little ironic, a little satirical, because I thought that the world in which I had been, thrown in, um, uh, was one where betrayal was really at sort of the common theme that I found at every layer of analysis that I could that I used to try to understand that world. I think we betrayed the Iraqi people for allowing so many very influential and very rich people steal from them when they were at their weakest. And within the UN, I also saw people backstab each other in, throwing what I would call bureaucratic banana peels under each other's feet. And you could just, the whole atmosphere was like a bunch of people who hate each other, but are forced to work together for world peace. So the
I think
premise.
that's a sentence that very well describes the UN and its governance issues.
That's right.
It's
So the book
yeah.
was called Backstabbing for Beginners: My Crash Course in International Diplomacy. It's on its third edition now, since the movie of the book came out. Movie by the same name came out in 2018, right before COVID, and then it was on HBO, and it's now on Amazon Prime in the US.
Very nice, very nice.
So yeah, Ben Kingsley played my former boss, and I'm played by the very good-looking Mr. Theo James. Most people might know him from the second season of White Lotus, or The Gentleman, I guess he's in now on
Yes.
Netflix.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
But
Yes,
it was very strange experience to be portrayed like that. Some of the scenes in the film were really evocative of the experience I had gone through. It's just that when I wrote about it, I had a bit of a protective layer. I'm someone who often uses humor as a way to sort of deflate tense situations.
yeah.
And that's always worked quite well for me in a variety of circumstances. So I adopted that tone in the book, and it was part of the reason for the success of the book also, because it's basically a first job gone wrong book. Some people might remember books like The Devil Wears Prada, or books like Liar's Poker, where which was Michael Lewis's first book. He wrote many others since that were made into films as well. But I adopted that kind of format to tell the story because corruption is not an entirely serious subject. It's people doing something they know is wrong, just because they think they might not get caught. And it's true that as long as the Iraqi people didn't have a voice or a free press, then we were never going to know about how we treated them when the UN and Saddam together had them under their control.
Well, I think there's
Uh,
isn't there also another aspect where, when you're in these big organizations and working with these big multinational companies, you can sort of put a veneer of honesty on top of it while those who want to get paid are getting paid underneath. And it sometimes takes, sometimes by mere accident or sometimes by intention to find out that the veneer of honesty is just that veneer.
It's something that if you ask British bankers in the Cayman Islands, they're good with that veneer, let's say.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, oil is the black elixir that makes our global economy go around. And usually in that business, when you're dealing with dictatorships, there's going to be 10 to 20% of any transaction that disappears to Switzerland or Qatar or whatever place they feel the money might be safe from being frozen in further sanctions and so on. So the beginning of what became really the rape of Iraq's oil infrastructure, which continues to this day, because today it's Iran that's essentially stealing Iraq's oil to evade the sanctions that are placed on them. So they pretend it's Iraqi oil going out, and because the Revolutionary Guards still exert some amount of influence in Iraq, they're able to reap some profits from the oil sales that country. So the two of the biggest oil suppliers in the world basically are still but the thing is, when you have to deal in it's a very common dilemma for the humanitarian community,
Mhm.
and I think that we have to just be honest about it. When you have to deliver food and go through warlords in Somalia or in the Congo, where I've also reported from, or in Afghanistan, you are going to pay bakshish, as it's called in Arabic. It's customary. Europe was also built. If you look at the Rhineland in Germany, it's a very rich. It's a very rich part of the country, because there were warlords that controlled much of the European trade at the time since the Middle Ages, and they would stop the boats and exact a toll on them. So the UN's role is not so much when you can't avoid paying your way to get access to the civilian population, then the least we can do is be honest about it. We may
Right.
still say that on balance it's worth doing our humanitarian work, but we have to be honest about the fact that it profits people that are very unsavory characters. And having been to Iraq and spoken with people from the village of Halabja, for example, which was gassed with a cocktail of VX and mustard gas by Saddam Hussein I think it was in the late 80s. They still live through that trauma today. Basically, it was like a James Bond film. Like, everybody just falls down after the plane, or the helicopters in this case, flew by. Everybody just suddenly smelled some if it was mustard gas, of course it has certain effects, but VX kills people in quite a horrible way. And so when you talk to people who have been tortured or who have seen their family members be tortured in front of them by Saddam's regime at the time, his Republican guards, the way they treated the minorities, well, in this case, the Shia were actually a majority in Iraq, but
Right.
they were treated as a minority. Then you understood that this regime was not going to allow anything through their hands that they weren't going to put their fingers on. So we were faced with a dilemma, but our job at the UN was to report the truth. And we, with a little veneer, as you say, of diplomatic speak, we managed to completely fail on our basic mission, which was to report on the distribution of goods in Iraq. So out of a $73 billion program that was fueled by Iraqi oil money, A lot of rich people got richer, while the Iraqi people got to be treated to completely infested food deliveries, soap that gave them rashes, and uh, spoiled medicines, in many cases, fake medicines. They were forced to operate in hospitals that didn't have electricity on the operating table. They didn't have enough painkillers. I mean, it was down to that. And despite that level of hardship, uh, many very influential and well-to-do people served themselves and served the Iraqi regime on their way. So when everything came to light, a lot of things happened. But one of the things that happened, of course, was that suddenly there was interest in a book about that story.
Right.
Um, and if you're familiar with the book industry, it's not easy to break in as a first time writer.
No, it is not.
Uh, and so I decided to do something that I had never thought I would do, which is to write an actual book about my experience. I had not intended to do this when I left the UN. I was like, let's not burn any bridges. Let's just move on. Um, but sometimes life forces you into a corner. Once you're branded a whistleblower, you might as well go with it, kind of.
No,
Um,
that's certainly true. And I think that is an excellent bridge into getting us into influence and media because you're kind of an influencer sort of thing. Um,
Occasionally.
and the media landscape from back then to now has changed so much. I remember when I first started getting into magazines and whatnot when I was 17 years old in 2005, which was 20 years ago, which is weird to think about and say. That um it was very old fashioned and there was a pathway and all this type of thing, and then social media arrives and the smartphone arrives right after it, and the media goes from the book, the newspaper, the television to you know our pockets. And so how has and that you talk a lot about that now, so how is this whole world, you know, with your own career, with the media, all this type of thing, how, what, in your view, what's the good, bad, and the ugly of how media works now? Because I have a tight 20 on that, but people didn't come here to hear me, they came here to see you, to hear you. So what's I mean, what in your, I mean, there's so many different angles in terms of, people that only read the headlines and we're losing literacy and all of these different things, but what's your view of the modern media landscape? The wasteland that it is.
I mean, I think we're all trying to figure it out together, right? As
True.
live as it happens. For example, nobody had predicted the first election of Donald Trump.
Nope.
Uh, Nobody, not even him. And yet, it was as if and in the second time around too, the Democrats were very much playing what they called their ground game, which
Right.
involved a lot of people knocking on a lot of people's doors when they were not necessarily invited.
Yes.
While they were waging a ground war, while Donald Trump's team was waging an air war through social media, and he
And there's been a
understood.
lot of talk about the Trump campaign and their use of podcasts, new media, especially apolitical podcasts that don't tend to talk about politics very much and who reach audiences who are not news junkies who follow politics. And they reach new audiences. And there was no Democrat answer to any of that. It went totally unanswered, all this sort of thing. And so there's been a lot of talk about, well, how do we fix and change that? I don't know that you can, but anyway, continue.
Well, no, but we have to understand what the battlefield looks like, and I think one important thing to understand is that our frontal cortex or our amygdala or whatever, it was explained to me by a psychiatrist, is basically wired to look at the most outrageous proposition that comes to us on our screen. I think you were very right earlier. Whoever controls this space
Mhm.
controls the choices we have in
It's
terms
the
of
most valuable
our.
piece of real estate in media.
It is
Yeah.
exactly. It's our screen. So now it's the battle for the screens, right? We're back to scrolling. So if you look at the history of writing, we started with hacking into wood and then stone, and then eventually writing on paper. And we had scrolls, and we would scroll through stories, from left to right or right to left, depending on the culture. But the earliest forms of writing were just oral tradition stories that were written down in scrolls. And then eventually, we invented the printing press. But what were the first big successes in the age of the printing press? They were actually stories about witchcraft. They were not stories about necessarily the most important or scientific, uh, even though these things were able to get published, they were not the first things to get widely distributed. So conspiracy theories were definitely some of the first mega hits in the age of the printing press. And we find ourselves in the same zone right now, which means that even though there's more information available to us than there has ever been in the history of mankind, we are not necessarily given freedom of choice. We have to choose between very polarizing takes on the news. And why are they polarizing? They're polarizing because uh, clickbait works by attracting our sense of outrage. So the most outrageous way the news can be presented on YouTube or other medium, they're going to attract the most clicks. And in the age we live in
Yes,
now,
I've always joked that this show would be more popular if I were more polarizing and outrageous, even though the exact purpose I do this is to not do that. But I've always joked that yes, that's, sort of thing. And I've when I have clips of my shows done, they're clipped by AI who also writes the titles, and they are the most caustic clickbait. They're much more popular than the long form, which I write myself. But I mean, regrettably, that is what attracts people. And I think we have so much there's so much information the human brain cannot process it all. It is
right.
not
So the job
possible.
of the journalist is to process it in a storied fashion, because story is our basic operating system. Okay,
Yes.
when it comes to information, the human mind is after the baby asks for food, he asks, I think, famously. Now there's a master class where Salman Rushdie, who for his freedom of expression has been stabbed in the eye and lost his sight as recently as 2 years ago, I think it was.
Yeah.
Um, the fatwa against him issued by Ayatollah Khomeini dates back from the late 1980s. And in 2020 something, finally,
Yeah.
someone, because there had been many attempts, but someone was able to get to him with a knife, stabbing him right in the eye. So freedom of expression, in and of itself, in many parts of the world, is dangerous. And in the parts of the world where we have it, what do we use it for? We use it to try to attract followers. And if we want to play that game, then we have to be as outrageous as possible initially, so that the algorithm ticker plays in our favor. And so, of course, when you make a thumbnails of, suddenly sometimes I find very fascinating interviews, but the thumbnail that I clicked on promised something else. Now that game is very familiar to the journalistic world. Titles have always been assigned by editors who are selling papers, and journalists have never been happy with the titles that were assigned on their articles. I've
Yeah,
experienced that myself when I wrote op-eds, and I realized these guys can just put whatever title they want on this,
it's
and
true.
sometimes it doesn't go exactly, along with the meaning that I intend. So it's a very interesting thing. But as long as you're going to have a distribution of information, then the distributors that make money from the distribution of information are going to look to play that game. So in the traditional American town, you had two newspapers, because there was the coal magnate and the railway magnate, or whatever it was that town
Yeah.
had as resources, right? And so both newspapers were typically bought by the richest man in town, or by his rival or her rival, mostly his at the time. And so they would of course take a position in political races, which frankly I've never understood the logic of. I don't know why the New York Times needs to necessarily, as a newspaper, support one candidate over another, when in fact their job is to report the news. They're telling us essentially we are biased in this way, and when you come to us, you're going to get content that is biased in a certain direction. And
Well,
that
it used to be a
undercuts
huge
their own
political
claim to
play by
public.
newspaper owners. I mean, it was a great way for like when you still had newspapers that were owned by people, not corporations, and you are Randolph Hearst, Horace Greeley, Catherine Graham.
Horace Greeley was a fantastic editor. Yeah.
I grew up in Denver, so I went to
Oh
school in a
wow.
town named after him, Greeley, Colorado. Um, and
He was editor of the New York Observer at the time, or what was it called?
as a Globe, I think New York Globe or something like that. But
Yeah, it was
yeah,
it was during the time of Henry Ward Beecher, who was in his own day the most famous man in America. And there's a Pulitzer Prize winning book called "The Most Famous Man in America," which I would also encourage everybody to read.
yes, and
Um,
speaking of people who run newspapers, Pulitzer, I mean, at one time, if you were a candidate and you could get a major city newspaper on your side, that could swing race, sort of thing.
well, case in point, Horace Greeley and Henry Ward Beecher, the most prominent preacher in America at the time, he was an anti-slavery preacher.
Yeah,
They got uh, they got Lincoln on the ticket.
yes, they did.
They invited him to New York. He gave his speech at first. He went to Beecher's church, because it was the most fashionable thing to do at the time, Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights, which was already a fancy area at the time. And then he went and gave his own speech. He was not as good a public speaker as Beecher was, but he essentially was chosen by the creme de la creme of New York's intelligentsia at the time to be the candidate, because at the time the Republican Party was the party of change. It was the party of progress, and the Democratic Party was, of course, pro-slavery. So you know how things change. Against many tall odds, Lincoln won the election, and almost immediately thereafter, the secession began.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating time in history, which we actually got the rights to the Pulitzer Prize winning book about Henry Ward Beecher, who was so famous at the time that soaps were named after him, dolls were named after him. The ferry that went to Brooklyn was called the Beecher Ferry, because people every Sunday would rush to try to make it to his one of his sermons, which were then famously published by the New York Independent as the star papers, because he wouldn't sign them himself. He would just put a star, and he was such a star. It was just incredible. So he was eventually
Yeah.
taken down in a sex scandal. But together with Spike Lee's production company, we've been shopping this project for a while, and it's so in terms of influence that you brought up, my sense when I left the UN, and I had then gone to film school, was that some stories are impossible to communicate because precisely because uh, because some issues are so politicized. With the UN at the time being like all the Democrats would automatically be pro UN no matter what, and all the Republicans would automatically be anti UN no matter what. And I didn't care about pro UN or anti UN. I was like, okay, well, we've got this organization. What do we do with it? And so for me, the values of transparency and accountability became clearly very important. But when it came to communicating to a wider public who does not know every acronym of every UN agency and so on, I thought that the storytelling medium, um, or vessel rather, was the most interesting one for me to study. And so the rules of drama are what they are. They were established, I think, in Aristotle's Poetics. Every book about screenwriting you can read is basically a repetition of the same rules that Aristotle established when he described what the structure of a tragedy, and how the other face the other face of that coin is of course the comedy. Um, and my story was somewhere in the tragic and the between the tragic and the comic. I faced situations where, you know, one minute you see a child on the verge of death, and the next minute you see a diplomat who just stepped in the mud before a meeting with Saddam Hussein. You know, so you've got situations that are anachronistic, and that I think that it was very easy for me to communicate with just with my own voice. You know, like telling stories as if I was telling them to someone at a bar, essentially.
Mm.
Um, and that was eventually how I sold this book. And the advice came to me by uh, uh, came to me from Sam Shepard, who I had randomly sat next to at a bar in New York, and we started chatting. And it was I had gotten 30 rejections for my book, and I thought, okay, I'm never gonna. I'm done trying to be a writer. And then I was talking to this guy who looked to me like he might be famous, or I didn't quite know, but I thought, oh, maybe he's a writer who wrote a book once, you know, and now he's like just a loser in the East Village. And it turned out to be so he talked to me for a while, and he was like, why are you abandoning your quest to become a writer? And I said, well, listen, I'm done. You know, I'm getting rejection letters from people who haven't even read what I sent. So what's the point? It's a very clogged system. And he said, you know what? just pitch your book the way you just because I told him my story essentially at the bar, right?
Right, yeah.
And you know what? Before I have to go to the Edinburgh Festival, I have a plane to catch. But why don't you just tell people the story on paper the way you just told it to me? I'm sure it's going to work out. And here's the number of an agent, and tell them you call them from me. So just to situate people, Sam Shepard is plays the commander in films like Black Hawk Down. He was the biggest theater writer in the 1980s, I guess, of his generation. So he was a monument when it came to storytelling, and I followed his advice, and I found that whatever story you're conveying, if you're able to connect with the audience on a personal level, and if you're able to be honest with yourself, then there's a lot more power in what you're able to project out there, and um, it's the type of advice you also need to give people who have their first time doing public speaking or things like that. Is people are actually on your side, and an example of that is if you would look at, for example, when we had President Bush and he couldn't pronounce things like nuclear, and things like that. Like
Yeah.
even when it was, and even if you were like a Democrat that didn't much care for him, when he was off script talking to the camera, you sat there at the edge of your seat hoping he could finish his fucking sentence, right? Because the
Right.
guy had no sentence structure going for him. So when he went off script, so the same thing happens ironically
Well,
with life.
that's Trump's whole shtick. I
Yes.
mean, that's his whole thing. Whatever, it's from brain to mouth, as short a journey as possible.
Well, he believes in his own bullshit. So in his world, he's not lying
No,
because he
no.
thinks that as long as he repeats it loud enough times, then it's true in his world.
Cogito ergo sum.
Well, I mean, it's amazing what lies are able to be perpetuated in our day and age. And I think the job of the mainstream media has really betrayed their audiences, and that's why they're going somewhere else for their news. Because the idea that every piece of news can be a story is also false. Sometimes you just got to give people the facts. Not
Yeah.
every piece of news is a story.
I always
Um,
say it on the news hour. I always say, remember, news is a narrative. That's why they call it a story. That's a Cameronism.
exactly, but
Yes.
when I was a young newsman, and I would report to my senior level journalists at CNN, and I would come to them and I'd be like, "Oh, the child mortality rate in Bangladesh has gone down by 15% last year." I found some, like press release, and they're
Mm.
like, "So what?" I'm like, "Well, maybe we should put that on the news." And they're like, "No, Michael, you don't understand. Good news is bad news. Bad news is good news." You know?
And
So
also it lacks sex appeal. It's not. I mean, it doesn't
yeah,
have
we
any.
need to
There's no
hate,
hook.
we need to
Yeah.
love, we need to have these extreme emotions. We turn to the news in the hope of getting some sense of satisfaction about a preconceived worldview that we hold, for various reasons. Sometimes because of our upbringing, sometimes because we find some theories very alluring. Obviously, Marxism held sway over a lot of people for a long time because it told a good story.
That's been
And
one of my criticisms of the hard sciences. Is science is excellent at giving us evidence of what is in our world, but it tells a terrible story. Religion has no evidence for anything, but it's a damn good story. So,
Yeah, and the big when you look at the Big Bang as a theory, and you look at in the beginning there was the heavens, and then there was light.
Yeah.
Um, well, I don't know that the Big Bang is necessarily much more convincing to me that out of nothing something suddenly explodes and creates everything. I'm like, how is that? Why do we need a beginning? Why couldn't things always have been existing, right? So there's
Right.
that fundamental question, and you see a lot of YouTube videos about just that,
Yeah.
because people still can't understand the notion that there was nothing, but we need there to be nothing because we need a beginning, right? Our operating system, a story,
Yeah.
needs a beginning. And we don't know how to imagine the beginning of everything without imagining a nothing.
Because we ourselves have a beginning and an ending. And so there needs to be a complete arc. You don't necessarily want to join the program already in progress that has always been infinitely backwards in progress and will be infinitely forward always in progress. That's not as elegant as a nice, neat arc.
No, but I think you're right, and that's why, even though the God of the Hebrews was an all-powerful, non-visible, unified, we call it monotheism as opposed to polytheism, meaning that there is one God instead of having the Greek and the Romans had, the God of thunder, the God of this, the God of that, Venus. She's the hot one for Fridays.
Then you go
Uh,
to India, they have a god for every 4,000 gods for everything. That's
yeah, but so this the we have a fundamental need to engage with what we don't understand and try to explain it in some way or another. And so, but when the Gospels came along and started telling the story of this one Jew who had gotten crucified by the Romans, then they started playing to, oh, so God has a son, and that story was much more easy to charm people in the Greek and Roman world because it actually fit in with their preconceived sort of uh, relationship with the divine. And so, 400 years after they crucified him, um, they then adopted his religion essentially.
yeah,
Um, and then years
that's the
later, the
power
same
of
church,
story, you
in the
know,
same name of that cross, which they then used as a like a motto. I mean, what do you call it?
a
It's
sigil.
yeah. I mean, it's the symbol of of a religion is a cross on which someone got nailed and bled to death. Um, so it's a good. I mean, if he had been, if his head had been chopped off, then we would be like Saudi Arabia and have a sword as a symbol. It was a very violent symbol, and it was a very Roman one. So then
Better
they
than
had
the
this
fish.
problem, huh?
Better than the fish.
Yeah, I mean, if the Jews had killed Jesus, who was Jewish, then typically they would have stoned him in those days, and even in
Yeah.
those days, I think stonings had kind of stopped. But so it was a Roman torture instrument of death, and the church had this problem, which was that how can you be so saintly if you are the ones who actually nailed the guy that you are now bowing to the cross, and how in his name can you go and kill off other minorities, or go on crusades, or lead the Spanish Inquisition in the name of this dead Jew, essentially, which this
Right.
cross represents. So it's very strange, but today we have the same phenomenon that happened as early as October 8th, in the Western world, where politics aside, I completely understand that when people see images of suffering civilians. I started my career there, trying to help the Arabs and the Kurds of Iraq out at a time when there was very high child mortality and basically a completely destroyed infrastructure. I understand that one can have very, very strong feelings when one sees the harm that war brings on civilians. But when I look at the influence game that was bought and paid for by countries like Qatar and the incredible network that was the boycott, divest, and I don't know what the S stands for, but BDS.
Yeah, I forget. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so suddenly you had alliances with Black Lives Matter, which didn't quite make sense because the way Black people are treated in the Arab world is still quite racist, to say the least. The word for a Black person in Arabic is abed. Abed means slave, or servant. So if you're Abdallah, you're the servant of Allah. But for Black people, they just call them Abed, like, psh. And the slave trade, of course, was run mostly by on the east coast of Africa, was certainly run by the Moors, as we called them at the time, or by Arabic tribes, and was very common. There were Black slaves in Iraq dating back to. So Ahmed Chalabi had a daughter. She grew up in a different time, when her father was a good friend of the King of Jordan. They had a bit of a falling out, massive falling out, in fact. And But so a lot of Somali or Ethiopian people were brought up to Iraq and worked as slaves, and were brought up to Saudi and worked as slaves. And it continues to this day. I mean, slavery is rampant in the Gulf, and in many countries. So for example, the connection, the fact that Black Lives Matter Chicago chapter issued a statement of support for Hamas the day after, it came as a shock to the system. I think for a lot of people, they didn't understand the connection. And the connection is a narrative.
Yes.
And it's a narrative of victimhood, which easily latches on to what we already believe to be true, and therefore easily becomes a narrative that gets a lot of followers.
Well,
Uh,
there's also, I think, a shared idea of solidarity and justice between the African American community and the Palestinian community in regards to oppression, stolen land, all this type of thing. A lot of, forcibly being moved from where you are to where they want you to go. Both Native
yeah,
Americans and
which the
African
Jews
Americans in
have
this
a few
country.
notes to add
uh,
on as well.
yeah, I mean,
They were they were
no one has clean hands in this situation.
No,
That's
no,
what
but
kind of
I
makes it
mean
difficult.
the Jews that are in Israel today are for the most part the children of refugees who went there
Yes.
after the World War II, and
Or escaping Tsarist and Leninist pogroms in Russia.
yeah, and escaping Arab nationalism, which was also very, very dangerous for the very prominent Jewish community of in Iraq, in Iran, There was a lot of Jews and a strong tradition of cultural relations between, I mean, Iranian Jews are so Iranian that it's, I can't tell the difference between Jewish Iranians from Forest Hills and Muslim Iranians, Americans, for
Yeah.
example, because so much is in common in their culture. But refugee against refugee is kind of a battle where both sides have a victimhood narrative that is true, because every time there was a conflict, it created refugees. And every conflict since the beginning of time has created refugees.
Of course.
And um, it's just that people have a need in the West when they watch their news. It's kind of, it's kind of become a bit of part of our entertainment system. When we're not on Netflix, we're on YouTube looking for, what are we gonna
Well,
learn
and
about the
people,
world today? And so
yeah.
we
And
all
people
we
want
all
to pick sides. They want to be, be for a side, rooting for somebody. And Lord knows the Israel-Palestine situation does not lend itself to that dichotomy whatsoever. You
not so
know.
easily. I mean,
Yeah.
are do we want to do the hard work of looking at facts and trying to make sense of them ourselves? And do we want to do we want to do the hard work of thinking for ourselves?
Right.
The best advice I got when I started at the United Nations was from a British spy, essentially, character. But he told me, Michael, you're stepping into something that is much more complicated than you realize. There's huge amounts of, there's a lot of money at play, and the regime we're dealing with in Iraq is a very tough one. So you have to be your own man, and you have to think for yourself, and you have to come to your own conclusions. And even when I'm wrong, I think that's fine. Like, it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to change your perspective or your impression of a certain a social conflict the more you learn about it. But choosing sides is not necessarily our job. I mean, it's not everything is a football match, or a game, or a soccer match rather. Not everything is can be sports is what we use in order to not go to war. But human beings are
Right.
pretty aggressive animals, as we've learned from the Yuval Harari's book *Sapiens*, and
Yes.
so
Yes.
in sports, yes, we can build narratives that allow us to get the full sort of emotional experience we're looking for. Because what are we looking for? We're looking for catharsis.
Yeah.
We're looking for a moment where we understand it all, and where we can direct our emotions in. So we have a choice, either in a communal positive direction, which we call catharsis, or as hate. As long as we can pinpoint an object of hate that we can dehumanize, then as human beings, we're a go. Before the genocide in Rwanda, they for weeks on end on the radio, they started calling the Tutsis uh, cockroaches, and they dehumanized them to the point where they were able to then eventually conduct a genocide that killed 800,000 people, mostly with machetes. I mean, imagine that kind of blood. And when you've written a book like mine, you have a lot of potential whistleblowers or people with stories that contact you, and they want to write their own stories, right? And so they're looking for advice and so on. And once a woman contacted me that had been smuggled out of Rwanda in a suitcase. I'm like, who fits in a suitcase? But anyway, she apparently did when she was young enough, and for 24 hours she spent breathing through a little hole in a suitcase, and she was smuggled out, and she all of her family was killed, and she
That's how
was
they
calling
got
me.
Chagall out of Vichy,
She was
France,
having a
in
mental
a crate.
breakdown.
Yeah,
Sorry, you were saying?
that's how they got Chagall out of France, in Vichy, France, in a crate with a
In a
straw.
crate. Yeah, well,
Yeah,
it's a pretty traditional. We got a guy out of Iraq wrapped in a carpet. So one of
lay
our guys
down here, we'll
got
roll
into
you
a
up.
car
Yeah,
accident, and the Iraqis wanted to put him in jail, and he was a fellow Dane. So me and some other Danes who were part of the security team figured out a way to create a extra room in the back of a car, and we just rolled him in a carpet, put him in there, got him out. Yeah.
yes. Well, I think that's an excellent place to end. We've gone much over time, but it was so fascinating. It was entirely worth it. So, let us know where we can find you online and keep up with you.
Well, Michael Sousson, if you just write my name, usually my site will pop up. And my
Yeah.
next book will not be about my bumbling experiences as a young diplomat. It'll be about some observations I've been able to make about just what we were talking about, the mechanics of influence, and how easily we get polarized when issues that can seem binary are presented to us.
That's excellent. Thank you. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. This is one of those days that I love my job. So thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
It's such a pleasure. We have the same job, you know.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.